The morning sun painted golden streaks across the New York skyline as Ambassador Sarah Thompson navigated her Mercedes through the winding roads of Bedford Hills. The leather-bound steering wheel felt cool beneath her fingers as she rehearsed her upcoming United Nations address in her mind. At 45, Sarah had mastered the art of preparation, yet something about today felt different. A subtle energy in the air that whispered of change. Her reflection in the rearview mirror showed a woman who carried authority with ease. Her dark hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and her eyes sparkled with the wisdom gained from 2 decades of international diplomacy. The carefully chosen charcoal gray suit and pearl earrings reflected her signature style. Professional yet approachable, powerful yet warm. The dashboard clock read 7:30 a.m., giving her plenty of time to reach the UN headquarters for her 11 o'clock a.m. presentation. Sarah had always believed in arriving early, a habit instilled by her grandmother, who used to say, "Excellence begins with preparation." A smile touched her lips as she remembered those words, not knowing how prophetic they would prove to be on this particular morning. Bedford Hills welcomed her with its charming Main Street, where local shops were just beginning to open their doors. The sweet aroma of fresh-baked goods wafted from Mary's Bakery, mixing with the crisp autumn air. Sarah made a mental note to stop there on her return trip, assuming everything went according to plan. But plans, as Sarah well knew from her years of diplomatic work, had a way of taking unexpected turns. The first hint of trouble came as a subtle vibration in the steering wheel. Then, without warning, the engine light blinked to life on her dashboard, its angry red glow mocking her carefully planned schedule. "Not now," Sarah murmured, her eyes scanning the street for a safe place to stop. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, a woman who had negotiated peace treaties and handled international crises, being derailed by a car issue in a small town. Finding a spot proved challenging as the morning traffic began to pick up. Local residents hurried about their daily routines, coffee cups in hand, unaware that a UN ambassador was searching for parking among them. Sarah finally managed to guide her car into the only available space she could find, conscious that it might not be an ideal spot, but hoping for understanding given the circumstances. As she stepped out of her vehicle, Sarah's phone buzzed with messages from her team in New York. Her assistant, Michael, had already sent 3 texts about last-minute changes to her presentation. The morning breeze carried the sound of distant church bells, their melody a stark contrast to the growing tension of her situation. Sarah straightened her suit jacket and took a deep breath, her diplomatic training kicking in. She had learned long ago that grace under pressure wasn't just a skill for international negotiations. It was a way of life. With practiced efficiency, she made 2 quick calls, one to her automotive service and another to Michael, updating him on her situation. What happened next would prove to be more than just a minor detour in her morning schedule. As she walked toward the courthouse to ensure her car wouldn't cause any issues where she'd parked it, Sarah couldn't have known that she was about to become part of a story that would touch hearts and change minds in this small town and beyond. The historic courthouse loomed ahead, its red brick facade glowing in the morning light, holding no hint of the extraordinary events about to unfold within its walls. Judge Robert Henderson's morning routine unfolded with the precision of a well-maintained timepiece. At exactly 8:15 a.m., he straightened his body before the antique mirror in his chambers, a ritual unchanged in his 15 years on the bench. The silver at his temples had grown more pronounced over those years, but his blue eyes remained sharp, missing nothing in his courtroom. Through the window of his second-floor office, he observed the usual morning parade of court employees and early defendants making their way up the courthouse steps. The familiar sight reinforced his sense of order and control, elements he considered essential to the proper functioning of justice. His clerk, Jenny Martins, knocked softly before entering with his morning docket. "Good morning, Your Honor," Jenny said, placing the files on his desk with practiced care. "We have 12 cases this morning, mostly routine matters." She hesitated for a moment before adding, "There's also a parking situation that just came up." Henderson nodded, barely glancing at the additional note. After handling thousands of cases, he'd developed a rhythm, a way of moving through the day's proceedings with maximum efficiency. Some called him strict. He preferred to think of himself as consistent. Justice doesn't play favorites, his father, also a judge, used to say. The morning session began precisely at 9:00 a.m. The familiar creak of the courtroom's oak doors and the rustle of papers created the backdrop to what Henderson expected to be another ordinary day. The first few cases proceeded smoothly. A speeding ticket, a minor property dispute, each handled with his characteristic swift efficiency. Then Sarah Thompson entered the courtroom. Her presence immediately changed the atmosphere, though Henderson, focused on his papers, didn't immediately notice. She carried herself differently from the usual parade of defendants. Shoulders back, head high, with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to commanding rooms far grander than this modest courthouse. Case number 47, Jenny announced, her voice carrying a slight tremor that Henderson missed. Regarding an improperly parked vehicle on Main Street, Henderson peered over his reading glasses, his usual stern expression firmly in place. "Name?" he asked, already reaching for his gavel, anticipating another routine matter. "Sarah Thompson, Your Honor," came the response, her voice clear and measured, carrying traces of both American education and international experience. The judge's pen paused briefly over his notepad. Something about her tone made him look up properly for the first time, but his well-worn script was already in motion. "Miss Thompson, you're here regarding a vehicle parked in a restricted zone. How do you plead?" "If I may explain the circumstances, Your Honor," Sarah began, her diplomatic training evident in every word. "My vehicle experienced unexpected mechanical difficulties, and I was forced to. A simple guilty or not guilty will suffice," Henderson interrupted, falling back on decades of handling similar explanations. The morning light streaming through the high windows cast shadows across his face, highlighting the deep lines of authority etched there. The gallery, usually half asleep during morning traffic court, stirred with interest. Jenny shifted uncomfortably at her desk, her fingers hovering over her keyboard as she debated whether to speak up. The weathered clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking each moment of this increasingly remarkable morning session. Neither the distinguished judge nor the accomplished ambassador could have predicted how the next few minutes would reshape not only their day but the entire community's perspective on justice and understanding. Sarah Thompson stood perfectly still before the bench, her years of diplomatic experience evident in her composed demeanor. The morning sunlight streaming through the tall courthouse windows caught the subtle threads of silver in her dark hair, creating an almost ethereal effect that didn't go unnoticed by the now attentive audience. "Your Honor," she began again, her voice carrying the perfect balance of respect and self-assurance, "I understand the court's time is valuable. I had an urgent situation with my vehicle while en route to an important meeting in New York City. I made every effort to—" Judge Henderson raised his hand, a gesture he perfected over years of maintaining order in his courtroom. "Miss Thompson, the sign clearly states no parking. Loading zone only. The law doesn't make exceptions for important meetings." His tone carried the weight of countless similar cases, each handled with the same unbending adherence to protocol. The gallery's usual morning drowsiness had completely evaporated. Even the court officer, typically stoic during these proceedings, found himself drawn into the unfolding scene. There was something compelling about the contrast between the judge's rigid authority and Sarah's graceful persistence. Jenny Martinez's fingers danced nervously over her keyboard, her eyes darting between her computer screen and the morning's newspaper lying partially hidden beneath her desk. Something about Sarah Thompson seemed hauntingly familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. "I respect the court's position," Sarah continued, drawing from her experience in navigating delicate international negotiations. "However, I believe context is crucial in any situation. My vehicle was experiencing mechanical failure, and I was faced with a choice between creating a traffic hazard or temporarily using the loading zone while awaiting assistance." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. It wasn't just what she said, but how she said it. Each word carefully chosen, her tone remaining perfectly measured. Judge Henderson found himself sitting slightly straighter in his chair, an unconscious response to the unexpected challenge to his routine. "Miss Thompson," he said, allowing a note of impatience to creep into his voice, "while I appreciate your eloquence, this is a simple matter. The sign was clearly visible, and your vehicle was undeniably in violation. Do you have any legal justification for your actions?" At that moment, Jenny's eyes widened with sudden recognition. The newspaper article she'd been trying to remember. There it was, right on page 3. Her hand shot up instinctively, but court protocol kept her momentarily silent, caught between professional duty and personal urgency. Sarah reached into her briefcase, her movements unhurried despite the rising tension. "Your Honor, I believe this documentation may be relevant to the situation." She withdrew a leather folder embossed with gold diplomatic seals, their significance lost on no one who could see them. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted perceptibly. The morning sun had fully risen now, casting long shadows across the wooden floor and highlighting the growing look of uncertainty on Judge Henderson's face. Even the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams seemed to pause, as if sensing the pivotal moment approaching. Before Sarah could step forward with her credentials, Jenny finally found her voice. "Your Honor," she called out, her words cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. "I believe there's something you need to see immediately regarding Miss Thompson's status." The wheels of justice, so firmly under Judge Henderson's control just moments before, were about to take an unexpected turn. The leather folder in Sarah's hand seemed to carry its own gravity, drawing all eyes in the courtroom toward it. Outside, clouds shifted across the morning sun, sending alternating patterns of light and shadow dancing across the proceedings. Judge Henderson's courtroom had never felt quite so still. Sarah's phone vibrated silently in her pocket, undoubtedly another message from her anxious staff at the United Nations. The world was waiting for her presentation on international education initiatives, but here she stood, caught in an unexpected moment of small-town justice. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Your Honor," Jenny called out again, her voice stronger now as she hurried toward the bench with a printout from her computer. "I believe this is rather urgent." Her hands trembled slightly as she handed the paper to Judge Henderson, whose eyes began to scan the document with increasing intensity. Meanwhile, Sarah's diplomatic aide, Michael Chen, had managed to slip quietly into the back of the courtroom. Fresh from a 2-hour drive from the city and still catching his breath, he watched the scene unfold with growing concern. The morning's UN session would begin in less than 2 hours, and here was his ambassador, entangled in small-town bureaucracy. Judge Henderson's reading glasses slipped slightly down his nose as he studied the paper before him. The courtroom remained hushed, the usual shuffling and whispering conspicuously absent. Even the ancient radiator in the corner seemed to have stopped its usual clanking, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. "Miss Thompson," the judge began, his tone noticeably different from moments before. "This document suggests that you—" He paused, adjusting his glasses, as if the words might somehow rearrange themselves into something more expected. Sarah stepped forward with natural grace. "Yes, Your Honor. I serve as the United Nations Ambassador for International Education Relations. I was en route to deliver the keynote address at today's Global Education Summit when my vehicle experienced difficulties." She gestured to the leather folder she still held. "My diplomatic credentials are here, if you'd like to review them." A soft gasp rippled through the gallery. The young intern manning the courthouse coffee cart nearly dropped her serving tray. Judge Henderson's stern expression flickered, showing the first signs of uncertainty since the day began. Michael Chen shifted anxiously in his seat, checking his watch for the 5th time in as many minutes. The morning's carefully planned schedule was unraveling with each passing moment. His phone buzzed with another message from UN headquarters, the 4th in the last 30 minutes. Jenny Martinez stood at her desk, her earlier nervousness replaced with a quiet satisfaction at having recognized the situation in time. The morning newspaper on her desk now lay fully visible, showing Sarah's photo alongside an article about her groundbreaking work in international education reform. Judge Henderson cleared his throat, buying precious seconds as he processed this dramatic shift in circumstances. The weight of his earlier dismissive tone hung heavy in the air. His courtroom, usually a place of absolute certainty and clear-cut decisions, had transformed into something entirely unexpected. "I believe," he said finally, his voice carrying a new note of careful consideration, "that we may need to review this matter in more detail." The words seemed to echo off the high courthouse ceiling, marking a turning point in what had begun as a routine morning in traffic court. Sarah's diplomatic training had taught her that moments of tension often held the greatest potential for positive change. As she stood before the bench, poised and patient, she understood that this unexpected detour might lead to something far more significant than a simple parking fine. The golden diplomatic seal on Sarah's credentials caught the morning light as she handed them to Jenny, who carried them to Judge Henderson with measured steps. The courtroom held its collective breath, the only sound being the gentle shuffling of papers and the steady tick of the wall clock marking each momentous second. Judge Henderson's reading glasses sat perched on the edge of his nose as he examined the documents before him. His fingers, usually so steady in their handling of court papers, trembled almost imperceptibly. The credentials were impeccable, official United Nations diplomatic papers, complete with international seals and security watermarks. "Ambassador Thompson," he said finally, his voice carrying a new weight of recognition. The title hung in the air, transforming the atmosphere of the small-town courthouse. The earlier Miss Thompson felt like a distant memory, swept away by the reality of who stood before his bench. Sarah maintained her dignified posture, but her eyes softened as she watched understanding dawn across the judge's face. In her years of diplomatic service, she had learned that such moments of revelation could either build bridges or create chasms. The next few minutes would determine which path this encounter would take. Michael Chen, still seated in the back, finally allowed himself to relax slightly. He'd seen his ambassador handle delicate situations across 5 continents, but something about this small-town courthouse drama felt uniquely significant. His phone had finally stopped buzzing. Perhaps even the UN officials had sensed that something important was unfolding. "Your Honor," Sarah spoke, her voice gentle but firm, "I want to assure you that I have the utmost respect for local laws and authorities. My current situation was truly one of necessity rather than negligence." She paused, allowing her words to settle. "Perhaps we could use this moment to discuss how diplomatic relations work at all levels, from small towns to global institutions." The morning sun had reached its mid-morning position, casting a warm glow through the high windows that seemed to spotlight the space between the judge's bench and where Sarah stood. The light illuminated both of them equally, erasing the hierarchical distance that the courtroom architecture tried to impose. Judge Henderson removed his glasses slowly, a gesture that the regular courthouse attendees recognized as significant. His usual stern demeanor had given way to something more contemplative. The weight of his earlier rushed judgment pressed heavily on his shoulders, visible in the slight slump that had replaced his typically rigid posture. "Ambassador Thompson," he began again, his tone markedly different from his earlier judicial brevity, "I believe I owe you an apology. It appears I was hasty in my initial assessment of the situation." The words seemed to cost him something, but they also appeared to lift a weight from him. Jenny Martinez watched from her desk, her earlier anxiety replaced by quiet satisfaction. The morning's newspaper article that had triggered her recognition now lay prominently on her desk, a photo of Sarah addressing the United Nations General Assembly clearly visible. The gallery, which had remained unusually quiet throughout the proceedings, stirred with a new energy. The story of what was unfolding would undoubtedly spread through Bedford Hills before sunset, but something told them that this was more than just a tale of mistaken identity and revealed credentials. Sarah took a step closer to the bench, her movement deliberate and graceful. "Your Honor," she said, "perhaps this unexpected meeting could serve a greater purpose than either of us initially imagined." The tension in the courtroom had transformed into something entirely different, an atmosphere of possibility. Judge Henderson stepped down from his bench, a rare occurrence that caused a subtle ripple of whispers through the gallery. His decision to leave his elevated position spoke volumes about the changing dynamics of the morning. "Ambassador Thompson," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that his regular court attendees had never heard before, "would you join me in my chambers? I believe we have much to discuss." He gestured toward the polished wooden door behind the bench, then glanced at the gallery. "Court will recess for 15 minutes. Sarah nodded graciously, turning first to Michael Chen. "Please inform the UN that I'll be slightly delayed. Sometimes the most important diplomacy happens in unexpected places." Her subtle smile carried years of wisdom about how real change often occurred in these unplanned moments. The judge's chambers felt smaller than usual as these two distinguished figures settled into the leather chairs facing each other across his antique desk. Morning sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the numerous law books and certificates that lined the walls, symbols of a life dedicated to justice. "I must admit," Judge Henderson began, his hands clasped on his desk, "in 15 years on this bench, I've never had a morning quite like this one." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "Your handling of this situation has been enlightening." Sarah leaned forward slightly, her diplomatic instincts telling her this was a crucial moment. "You know, Judge Henderson, in my work at the UN, I've learned that the most meaningful conversations often begin with moments of misunderstanding. It's what we build from those moments that truly matters." Outside the chambers, the courthouse buzzed with excited whispers. Jenny Martinez found herself surrounded by curious colleagues, all eager to hear how she had recognized the ambassador. The young intern who had nearly dropped her coffee tray earlier was now proudly serving refreshments to the waiting gallery, adding her own flourishes to the retelling of the morning's events. Back in the chambers, Judge Henderson reached for a photograph on his desk, one showing him at his swearing-in ceremony years ago. "When I took my oath of office," he reflected, "I promised to administer justice fairly and impartially. Today has reminded me that true justice requires us to look beyond our first impressions." Sarah's eyes fell on another photograph, this one showing the judge at a local community event. "You clearly care deeply about this community," she observed. "Perhaps we could channel this morning's experience into something beneficial for Bedford Hills." The judge's face brightened with interest. "What did you have in mind, Ambassador?" "Well," Sarah began, her voice animated with possibility, "I'm scheduled to speak about global education at the UN today, but I believe education begins at home, in communities like this one. What if we arranged a series of cultural exchange programs, starting right here in Bedford Hills?" The morning sun had reached its full strength now, bathing the chamber in warm light. Outside, the courthouse square continued its daily routine, unaware that within these walls, an unexpected partnership was taking shape, one that would soon transform their small town in ways no one could have predicted. Judge Henderson extended his hand across the desk. "Ambassador Thompson, I believe this could be the beginning of something remarkable." His genuine smile erased the last traces of the stern judge from earlier that morning. Sarah took his hand warmly, knowing that sometimes the best diplomatic achievements happened far from the grand halls of the United Nations. News travels fast in small towns, and by afternoon, the story of the morning's events had spread through Bedford Hills like wildfire. The local cafe buzzed with animated conversations, and the high school principal had already called an impromptu assembly to share the exciting developments with her students. Sarah's delayed arrival at the United Nations had transformed into an unexpected triumph. Standing at the podium in New York, she began her education initiative speech with a fresh anecdote from Bedford Hills, drawing knowing smiles from her colleagues. "Today, I experienced firsthand how wisdom can emerge from the most unexpected encounters," she told the assembled diplomats. Back in Bedford Hills, Judge Henderson sat in his office, phone pressed to his ear, as he coordinated with the town council. The morning's events had sparked something in him, a reminder of why he'd become a judge in the first place. On his desk lay a proposal for a new community program, its pages filled with ideas born from his conversation with Sarah. "Yes, Mayor Williams," he said into the phone, his voice carrying an enthusiasm his staff hadn't heard in years. "Ambassador Thompson has agreed to make Bedford Hills a pilot location for the UN's new local outreach initiative. This could put our town on the map for all the right reasons." Jenny Martinez had become the courthouse's unofficial historian of the morning's events. During her lunch break, she carefully archived the newspaper article that had helped her recognize Sarah, adding it to a new folder labeled Bedford Hills International Exchange Program, Origins. The local high school's model UN club, which had struggled to maintain membership in recent years, suddenly found itself overwhelmed with interested students. Their faculty advisor, Mrs. Chen, no relation to Michael, could hardly contain her excitement as she pinned up a photo of Ambassador Thompson on the club's bulletin board. Sarah's car, the inadvertent catalyst for all these changes, had long since been repaired. A simple fix by Joe's Auto Shop, whose owner now proudly displayed a photo of himself with the ambassador in his waiting room. The loading zone where she had parked was being considered for designation as a historical marker, much to the amusement of local residents. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, Judge Henderson found himself standing in the same spot where Sarah's car had been parked that morning. A group of high school students walked by, animatedly discussing their plans to study international relations in college. He smiled, remembering Sarah's words about how change often begins in unexpected places. The courthouse staff had already begun preparations for next month's International Cultural Festival, an idea that had sprung from Sarah and the judge's conversation. The normally austere building would soon be transformed into a celebration of global unity and understanding, starting with the very community it served. Michael Chen, having finally relaxed after the morning's adventures, sat in a quiet corner of the local diner, drafting a report about the day's events for the UN archives. His fingers flew across his laptop keyboard as he documented how a potential diplomatic incident had evolved into a model for community engagement. As evening approached, Sarah's phone lit up with a message from Judge Henderson. The town council unanimously approved the exchange program. "Your morning detour may have been the best thing to happen to Bedford Hills in years." She smiled, composing her reply while gazing out at the New York skyline from her office window. Sometimes, she reflected, the most meaningful change doesn't come from grand plans and formal ceremonies, but from simple moments of human connection and the willingness to see beyond first impressions. 1 year later, the Bedford Hills Courthouse Square bustled with activity as townspeople gathered for the first anniversary of the International Cultural Festival. Colorful banners fluttered in the spring breeze, and the aroma of global cuisines filled the air. At the center of it all stood Judge Henderson and Ambassador Sarah Thompson, their unlikely friendship now a cherished part of local lore. Hard to believe it all started with a parking violation. The judge mused, adjusting his signature bounty, now adorned with small UN flag pins, a gift from Sarah. The stern magistrate of a year ago had been transformed, not just in appearance, but in spirit. His courtroom had become known as a place where justice was served with both wisdom and understanding. Sarah, taking a brief break from her UN duties to attend the celebration, watched as a group of high school students performed traditional dances from 5 different continents. "Sometimes the best diplomatic achievements happen outside embassy walls," she replied, her eyes twinkling. The Bedford Hills Youth Ambassador Program she had helped establish had already sent 3 local students to UN summer programs. Jenny Martinez, now the director of the town's new cultural exchange office, approached with a leather-bound album. "Look what we found in the archives," she said, opening to a page showing the original newspaper article that had helped her identify Sarah that fateful morning. The album, chronicling the year's achievements, had become a symbol of how one small moment could spark tremendous change. The courthouse itself had evolved, its halls now adorned with artwork from sister cities across the globe. The loading zone where Sarah had parked her car bore a small plaque, "Where global understanding begins." Local teenagers often took selfies there, adding the hashtag #DiplomacyStartShare to their posts. Judge Henderson's morning docket now included a monthly Global Justice Forum, where students could learn about legal systems worldwide. Today's session had featured a video call with a judge from South Africa, part of an international judicial exchange program that Sarah had helped coordinate. "Your Honor," Sarah said, using his formal title with the warmth of an old friend, "I have some news from the UN. They want to use Bedford Hills as a model for their new local communities Global Impact Initiative. Apparently, our little parking incident has inspired similar programs in small towns across 6 continents." The judge smiled, remembering how differently things could have turned out that morning. His weekly cultural sensitivity training sessions for court staff, initially met with skepticism, had become popular professional development opportunities, often attended by officials from neighboring counties. As the festival reached its peak, the high school band struck up a melody combining classical American tunes with international rhythms. The crowd gathered around the courthouse steps, where a ribbon-cutting ceremony would officially open the new International Understanding Center, housed in what was once an unused wing of the courthouse. Sarah and Judge Henderson stepped forward together, scissors in hand. Before cutting the ribbon, they exchanged knowing looks. 2 people from different worlds who had learned that justice, understanding, and friendship could bloom in the most unexpected places. "To new beginnings," Sarah said, raising her voice to address the crowd. "And to the power of second chances," Judge Henderson added as they cut the ribbon together. The applause that followed wasn't just for the ceremony. It was for every small miracle that had brought them to this moment, for every prejudice overcome, and for the reminder that sometimes the best detours in life are the ones we never planned to take.